They called him the Willow Creek Butcher, and history would remember him as America's first rural serial killer. But for the isolated farming families of Willow Creek in 1871, he wasn't a legend. He was the shadow in the fog, the presence you felt in the silence before your lantern flickered out. This is the macabre history of the Willow Creek Butcher, a story of vanishings, blood rituals, and the kind of evil that feeds on isolation. Willow Creek was the kind of place the rest of America forgot. A single dirt road ran through it, flanked by weathered barns and tilting fence posts. The air always seemed damp, the mist rising from the marshes in slow, suffocating curls. At night, that fog would swallow the farms whole, leaving only the creak of windmills and the occasional cry of a distant animal. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone who could move like a phantom, someone who could take, without ever being seen. The story begins quietly, the way all nightmares do. A neighbor, passing by the Murdoch farmhouse, noticed something odd. The chickens roamed freely in the yard, their feathers wet with dew, and the front door swung gently on its hinges. Inside, the table was set for dinner, a pot of stew still steaming on the stove. Upstairs, the bedding was soaked with blood, but there were no bodies. No screams had been heard. No tracks led away. It was as if the family had simply evaporated into the fog. Within hours, the news spread along the creek. Farmers gathered in whispers at fence lines, each face pale with a dread they couldn't put into words. They had all heard the old rumors, about the marsh that took what it wanted, about the things that crawled in the dark, but no one truly believed them until that night. And as the fog thickened around the Murdoch farm, an unspoken fear settled over the valley. Something had come to Willow Creek, and it had already chosen its first family. Before the butcher's shadow fell across Willow Creek, the town was a picture of quiet rural life, a life so predictable it lulled its people into a false sense of safety. Fewer than 24 families called the valley home, scattered across the low hills and flat stretches of farmland that met the marshes. Each house had its own dirt road, its own windmill creaking in the breeze, and its own rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Out here, neighbors were more than neighbors. They were lifelines. Everyone waved to everyone. No one locked their doors. And no one ever imagined the land itself might one day turn against them. The town's single road led to a rickety wooden bridge spanning the creek. Beneath it, the water moved lazily, heavy with mud and reeds that swayed like fingers. In spring, the air carried the scent of wet earth and honeysuckle. But in autumn and early winter, the fog rolled in thick, turning the world into a grey, muffled dream. On those nights, sound travelled strangely. You could hear a horse breathing from a mile away, but the footsteps just outside your window might seem to vanish into the damp air. The people of Willow Creek found the fog beautiful once. They would stand on their porches and watch it curl like smoke across the fields. But beauty can hide danger. In 1871, that isolation became the perfect hunting ground. There were no telegraphs here, no immediate help from the outside world. A scream in the night could travel across the marshes, but no one would ever know where it came from. The old stories about the land, about the marsh spirits and the hungry fog, were little more than bedtime warnings to keep children close to home. And yet, something in the air had changed. Dogs barked at nothing. Horses refused to take certain trails. The farmers began to sense what the land already knew. Something was moving through the fog that didn't belong to any natural world. It was in that quiet, trusting, isolated Willow Creek that the butcher began to hunt, hidden in plain sight, beneath the veil of mist that the townsfolk had once admired and would soon learn to fear. It began with the Murdochs. On the evening of November the 3rd, 1871, the last light of day slipped behind the hills, and a heavy fog bled across the fields. Neighbors would later recall that the mist seemed different that night, thicker, heavier, as if it carried weight. The Murdochs were a family of 5, Thomas, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 young children. They were known for their generosity, often sharing crops and livestock with neighbors. That night, no one saw them leave the property. No one heard a single cry. By morning, the farm had fallen silent. A passing neighbor, Henry Langford, was the first to sense something was wrong. He noticed the farmhouse door ajar, creaking gently in the wind. Chickens wandered freely in the yard, pecking at the mud, and the family's old milk cow bawled at the fence line, unmilked and restless. Inside, the air was cold and damp. A pot of stew still sat on the stove, its surface congealed, and the dining table was neatly set for 5. Upstairs, the horror became clear. The children's beds were soaked with blood, dark stains seeping into the wooden boards beneath. Thomas and Eleanor's room was no different, but there were no bodies, no footprints leaving the house, no signs of a struggle. Only one detail hinted at something beyond human comprehension. In the center of the master bedroom floor, crudely scratched into the wood, was a single word: offering. Sheriff James Harlan arrived by mid-morning, summoned by the frantic neighbors. He searched every room, every corner of the barn, and even the root cellar, expecting to find some trace of the missing family. Instead, he was met with silence and the suffocating weight of fog pressing against every window. As he stepped outside, a faint smell of iron and rot clung to the air, drifting in from the marsh. By sundown, word had spread along the creek. Families began to huddle indoors, lanterns lit, doors barred for the first time in memory. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, and the valley of Willow Creek knew a terror it had never felt before. The Murdocks were gone, swallowed whole by the night. By the next morning, Willow Creek was a town transformed by fear. What had once been a quiet, trusting community now carried the tremor of panic in every conversation. Neighbors whispered at fence lines, their voices trembling as they repeated the same words over and over. "The Murdocks are gone. Just gone." Families who had never locked a door in their lives began barring windows with planks and hammering nails into door frames. Guns were taken down from above fireplaces, and kerosene lamps were kept burning through the night, even as the fog pressed against every pane of glass. The isolation that once made life simple now became a curse. The local church became the heart of that fear. Father Alcott rang the bell at midday and called for a prayer gathering, but the sound that usually comforted the valley felt hollow and distant in the damp air. The congregation huddled inside beneath the wooden rafters, faces pale, hands twisting in anxious knots. They prayed for the Murdocks, prayed for protection, and prayed, quietly under their breath, that this was just a single, explainable tragedy. But even then, in the dim candlelight, some admitted what others refused to say. This was no accident. The land itself seemed to echo the fear. Dogs howled through the night, horses refused to go near the marsh, and the fog crept higher and heavier, curling against doors like a living thing. Those who dared step outside swore they felt eyes on them from the tree line, though no figure was ever seen. Sheriff Harlan moved from farm to farm, assuring families he would find answers, but even he felt the weight of something unnatural settling over the valley. He had seen violence before, fights, theft, drunken accidents, but this was different. This was planned, silent, and ritualistic. And the word carved into the Murdocks' floorboards, offering, hung in his mind like a noose tightening. That night, the fog returned thicker than ever, smothering every lantern's glow into a dim halo. In the distance, a single scream pierced the cold air, just once, sharp and short, then vanished into the mist. By sunrise, the townsfolk realized the nightmare had only just begun. The scream that tore through the fog that night would not be forgotten. But when dawn came, the town realized it had been a warning too late. The Whitaker family, 4 souls living on the northern edge of the valley, was gone. The Whitaker farmhouse was eerily similar to the Murdoch scene. Sheriff Harlan arrived just after first light, his boots sinking into the wet earth as mist curled around the fence posts. The front door was wide open, swaying in the morning breeze. Inside, the house was still warm from the stove, with a loaf of bread half sliced on the counter and a kettle hissing softly. Breakfast had been abandoned mid-preparation, as if the family had simply walked into the fog and vanished. But this time, there were new details. Strange tracks dotted the muddy floor near the door, long, smeared impressions, as though someone had dragged wet feet across the wood. Harlan crouched down and touched the prints. They were cold, slick with a layer of creek mud, even though the Whitaker farm was a mile from the water. Whatever had entered this home had brought the marsh with it. Upstairs, the bedrooms mirrored the horror of the first case. Sheets soaked in blood, yet no bodies. No broken windows, no forced entry. In the children's room, Harlan found something that would follow him in his nightmares. A small wooden doll, nailed to the wall upside down, its painted face gouged out. Beneath it, carved into the wood in jagged strokes, was the same single word, offering. By the time the sheriff stepped back onto the porch, neighbors had gathered along the road, their faces pale blurs in the fog. He didn't have to speak. The sight of his expression was enough to confirm their worst fears. The horror wasn't a one-time tragedy. It was a pattern. That evening, families huddled together in silence, clutching rifles and lanterns, but the fog moved like a predator outside their windows. In the distance, a barn door slammed against the wind, echoing through the mist like a gunshot. Somewhere out there, the butcher had chosen his next offering. Sheriff James Harlan had walked these fields his entire life, but on the night after the Whitakers vanished, Willow Creek felt like foreign ground. The fog pressed low against the earth, curling around his boots as he led his horse along the old trail toward the marsh. Lantern in one hand, revolver in the other, he followed the faint path that wound between skeletal trees and rotting fence posts. The only sounds his own footsteps and the distant drip of water. The sheriff had a theory. Whoever was hunting these families was using the creek trail. It ran behind most of the targeted farms, a forgotten route once used for moving supplies during the war. In the years since, it had grown over with brambles and weeds. Few locals dared to travel it at night, claiming the fog felt different near the water. Now, Harlan was certain the trail was the key. He stopped at a bend in the path where the air seemed colder. The beam of his lantern caught something in the mud, a partial footprint, long and narrow, as if the heel barely touched the ground. Nearby, drag marks traced into the dirt, vanishing into the undergrowth toward the creek. He followed them slowly, the mist swallowing his silhouette. Then he saw it. In a small clearing, where the trees opened to the marsh, animal bones littered the ground, some strung together with twine, forming crude shapes like circles and triangles. A rusted farm hook protruded from the mud, draped with the remains of a goat's skull, the horns blackened as though burned. This was no ordinary killer. This was a ritual. Harlan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He raised his lantern higher, the light reflecting off the waterlogged earth, then froze. From somewhere in the fog, a soft crunch of leaves. He spun, revolver aimed into the darkness. Nothing. The silence was heavier than the mist. Harlan stood still for several minutes, his breath clouding in the lantern light, until he finally forced himself to turn back. But in that silence, he knew he was no longer the hunter. He was being watched. That night, Sheriff Harlan returned to town with mud on his boots and dread in his chest, and a realization he couldn't ignore. Willow Creek was dealing with something far beyond an ordinary killer. 2 nights later, Sheriff Harlan returned to the trail, unable to sleep, the word offering burning in his mind. The town had grown deathly quiet. No dogs barking, no horses stirring in their stalls, as if every living thing sensed that the fog itself had become a predator. Harlan followed the same bend in the path, his lantern slicing through the mist, each step carrying him closer to the creek's edge. The ground grew softer as he approached the marsh, and that's when he saw them. Half-sunken wooden boxes, their edges black with rot, jutted out of the mud like the bones of some buried beast. He crouched low, heart hammering, and brushed away the wet soil. They were coffins, but far too small. There were 3 of them, each barely the length of a child. The wood was warped and waterlogged, but when Harlan pried the first one open with the edge of his revolver, he recoiled. It was empty. No body, no remains, just a lining of blackened straw and deep teeth marks scored into the wood. It was as if something, or someone, had gnawed at the inside, trying to escape. He moved to the second coffin, his lantern flickering in the damp air. Inside he found the same pattern, empty, clawed from within. By the time he reached the third, his hands trembled. He forced the lid open, and a cloud of cold, fetid air rushed out. Another empty coffin. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of water dripping from the trees. Then behind him, a branch snapped. Harlan spun, lantern lights swinging wildly through the fog. Shadows danced against the skeletal trees, but nothing moved. The forest held its breath. His heart pounded as he realized the truth. He was standing in the butcher's hidden ground, a place meant for something far worse than murder. The sheriff backed away slowly, never turning his back to the fog. He didn't know if he'd been discovered or simply allowed to leave, but he did know one thing. Willow Creek's evil wasn't finished. Winter came early to Willow Creek in 1871, and with it, the fog thickened into a near-permanent shroud. Snow fell in thin, wet sheets, coating the abandoned fields in a colourless, oppressive silence. Life slowed to a crawl. Families who once gathered at the church or met on fence lines now vanished into their homes for days at a time, curtains drawn tight, lamps burning at all hours. The valley had become a place of whispers and superstition. Some claimed the fog wasn't natural at all, that it rolled off the marsh like breath from the mouth of the butcher. Others began to speak in hushed tones of the land taking its offerings, reviving old folk tales of the marsh spirits that demanded tribute to protect the crops. Even the skeptics found themselves checking the corners of their barns and listening for footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone. Sheriff Harlan rode the empty trail each night, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. He felt the weight of a town unraveling. The Murdocks and Whitakers were gone, and now farmers refused to work their own land. He passed the Miller farm one night and saw the family sitting in a tight circle around the fireplace, rifles propped within arm's reach, faces pale and hollow. Then came the first snowfall over the coffins. Harlan returned to the creek one evening and found the clearing dusted white, the tiny rotted boxes half buried under frost. Fresh tracks, long deliberate steps, circled the coffins, then disappeared into the fog. Whatever haunted the valley hadn't stopped hunting. It was waiting, watching. By Christmas, Willow Creek no longer resembled a living town. The church bell remained silent. Smoke from chimneys rose into the frozen sky but gave no comfort. At night, the wind carried sounds that twisted the imagination. The creak of barn doors, the soft splash of water in the marsh, and sometimes, just for a heartbeat, the echo of a child's laugh in the distance. It was in that deep winter silence that the butcher prepared to strike again, and the town, already suffocating in fear, had no idea the worst was yet to come. It was the first week of January 1872 when Willow Creek's fragile silence shattered. A farmer named Elias Porter trudged through the brittle frost of his pasture at dawn, following the frantic barks of his hound. The dog clawed and snapped at a patch of disturbed earth, its fur bristling. At first, Elias thought it was a fox den. Then the frozen ground gave way, and a pale hand protruded from the soil. He staggered back, breath catching in the icy air. The hand was small, grey, and stiff with cold, the fingernails clogged with dirt as though they had clawed their way upward in vain. Elias ran to fetch Sheriff Harlan, and within the hour, two men were on their knees in the frozen field, digging with numb fingers. What they unearthed was not a body, but something far more unsettling. The hand was severed at the wrist, and beside it other limbs emerged, arms, legs, a foot, all arranged in a perfect circle, like the petals of a grotesque flower. At the center of that circle lay a burlap mask, soaked through with old blackened blood and streaked with creek mud. The mask's crude stitching and hollow eye-holes stared up from the earth, as if mocking the living. Sheriff Harlan felt the world tighten around him. This was no ordinary burial, no hurried attempt to hide a crime. It was ritual. Every detail, the circle, the mask, the careful placement, spoke of a mind consumed by something darker than simple murder. Elias muttered a prayer, his voice shaking. "It's him. It's the butcher." Harlan didn't respond. He studied the edges of the circle, the faint impressions in the frost where knees had pressed into the earth. Someone had knelt here for hours, performing something deliberate, patient. That night the sheriff called for the town to remain indoors, but word of the discovery spread faster than any warning. Neighbors began boarding up their windows, refusing to venture out even for water or feed. And somewhere, beyond the lamplight, the butcher walked the fields again, leaving his offerings for the fog to swallow. By mid-January, the grisly circle in Elias Porter's field had become the talk of every farmhouse and fence line, though most spoke of it only in whispers. The people of Willow Creek had always been superstitious in quiet ways, but now old fears came roaring back like a tide. The discovery of severed limbs and the blood-soaked burlap mask convinced the townsfolk that this was no ordinary killer. This was a ritual. This was a message. Sheriff Harlan visited Father Alcott that week, seeking some kind of guidance. Inside the small wooden church, the air was heavy with candle smoke and fear. The priest's face was pale as Harlan described the circle of limbs, the empty child-sized coffins, and the word offering carved into the Murdoch and Whitaker homes. Alcott shuddered and crossed himself. "There are old whispers," he said quietly. "Before the war, even before the settlers came, the creek was known as a place where sacrifices were made. They said the fog carried spirits, and that the land would take what it was owed." Harlan didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in men who used superstition to mask their sickness. If the butcher was performing rituals, it meant he was calculating, patient, and obsessed. A predator, playing with the town like a cat with a mouse. Back at the sheriff's small office, he began to sketch the evidence in his ledger. The empty coffins, the severed limbs, the upside-down doll nailed to the Whitaker wall. Patterns emerged. Every site was within reach of the old creek trail. Every act carried an element of ceremony. Meanwhile, the townspeople descended into isolation and hysteria. Families huddled in single rooms with lanterns burning all night, afraid to sleep. Dogs were shot for barking at the fog. Horses were found trembling in their stalls. The butcher had transformed the valley into a prison of fear. One evening, as Harlan walked the trail again, he noticed something new carved into a fence post in fresh, wet wood. Offering accepted. The message wasn't just a threat. It was communication. And for the first time, Harlan felt the weight of a horrifying truth. The butcher wasn't hiding from him. He was speaking to him. By late January, Sheriff Harlan knew he couldn't wait for the butcher to strike again. The man, if he was a man at all, was taunting him now, leaving carved messages and ritual displays like a hunter daring his prey to follow. The sheriff realized that to stop him, he'd have to become bait. Harlan devised a plan born of desperation. He selected an abandoned Miller farmhouse on the edge of the marsh, one that sat directly along the creek trail, where the butcher seemed to move unseen. He set it up like any occupied home, a lantern glowing in the front window, a fresh loaf of bread on the table, and a fire crackling in the hearth. In the barn, he tethered 2 pigs, hoping their restless movement and squeals would draw attention. That night, the fog was suffocatingly thick, and the temperature had dropped so low that the sheriff's breath hung like smoke in the lantern light. Harlan crouched in the shadows of the loft, pistol in one hand, lantern dimmed, heart thudding against his ribs. Outside, the world was nothing but white and grey, silent except for the occasional creak of the barn wood as it settled in the cold. Hours passed. His eyelids grew heavy, and the weight of the quiet pressed on his nerves. Then, without warning, the pigs began to stir, snorting and pawing nervously at the hay. A draught swept through the barn, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the marsh. Harlan froze, ears straining. Then he heard it. The faintest crunch of footsteps on the frosted ground outside, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was didn't hurry. They knew exactly where they were going. The barn door creaked, just enough to let in a slice of fog. Harlan held his breath as a shadow moved across the threshold, taller than he expected, with long, careful strides. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Then, from directly beneath the loft, a soft, rasping sound. Breathing. Harlan gripped his revolver tighter. The butcher had arrived. The barn was so silent, Harlan could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Below him, the pigs shifted uneasily, snorting and pawing at the straw. The fog seeped through the open door, blurring the edges of the world into soft grey shapes. Somewhere in that haze, the butcher moved. Slow, patient, confident. A figure emerged from the mist, stepping fully into the barn. Tall, lanky, wrapped in a tattered coat that hung like wet rags. His head was covered in the familiar burlap mask, crude stitches forming a mouthless grin, dark spots of old blood clinging to the fabric. He paused near the pigs, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Harlan froze, pistol. Toll aimed from the loft, breath shallow. He'd imagined this moment for weeks, rehearsed in his mind how he would yell a command, leap down, and finally end the nightmare. But staring at that faceless figure in the dim lantern glow, he felt something unexpected. The crushing weight of being prey. The butcher moved with a strange, almost ritualistic precision. He knelt in the hay, dragging a finger through the straw to form a circle, then placed a small object at its center, a child's wooden toy horse, its legs snapped off. He stayed like that for several heartbeats, head cocked toward the rafters, and Harlan could swear the man knew he was there. Then, just as suddenly, he rose and backed into the fog, never speaking, never rushing. Within seconds, the barn was empty except for the restless pigs and the sheriff's pounding heart. Harlan waited in silence, gripping his revolver, until the night swallowed all sound again. He descended from the loft, his hands trembling, and found the toy horse still sitting in the circle of straw. It was a message. The butcher had seen the trap, walked into it, and left unscathed, leaving Harlan with the terrifying knowledge that the game had only just begun. By February of 1872, Willow Creek was no longer a living town. It was a shadow of itself, a place where fear had rooted deeper than any crop. The once busy farms were abandoned or reduced to single rooms, where entire families huddled in silence, rifles clutched and lanterns flickering. No one walked the roads after dusk. No one visited neighbors. It was as if the valley itself had been given over to the butcher. The church bell, which had once been the heart of the community, fell silent. There were no funerals to ring for, because there were no bodies to bury. The missing were not dead in the way townsfolk could understand. They had simply vanished. The stories of the Murdocks and Whitakers spread beyond the valley, carried by traders and drifters. but no outsiders came to help. The isolation that had once kept Willow Creek safe now left it to rot in its own terror. Sheriff Harlan felt the weight of every empty home pressing on his conscience. He rode through the ghostly streets, hearing only the creak of abandoned barns and the soft whisper of the fog curling around fence posts. From time to time, he caught glimpses in the distance. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still. When he blinked, it was gone, leaving him questioning whether it had ever been there at all. Inside the sheriff's office, his ledger filled with sketches and notes that looked more like the writings of a man haunted than a lawman. Empty coffins, circles of limbs, burlap masks. Each clue led him nowhere. Each night, he returned to the creek trail, and each night the fog swallowed him whole without giving up the killer. Then came the discovery that confirmed the town's collapse into full paranoia. One morning, a group of men found the doors of the old Simmons barn swinging in the wind, the animals inside butchered, not for meat, but arranged in a spiral pattern on the floor above. In them, carved into the wood of the loft, a message, "No prayers will save you." From that day forward, no one trusted the night, and no one trusted the land. Willow Creek belonged to the butcher now. Sheriff Harlan had reached his breaking point. The town was dying, its people hollowed out by fear, and the butcher seemed to move like smoke, leaving terror but no trace of himself. Harlan knew that if he didn't take the hunt further, Willow Creek would never escape the shadow strangling it. He followed the creek trail deep into the marsh, boots sinking into black mud as fog licked at his lantern light. The air grew colder, heavier, until he heard it, the slow trickle of water beneath the earth. That's when he found the old drainage tunnels, a relic from the days when soldiers had tried to reroute the marsh to dry farmland. Most locals avoided them, muttering that the tunnels breathed at night. Harlan crouched at the entrance, the smell of rot and wet soil hitting him like a wave. He raised his lantern and stepped inside. The tunnel's walls were slick, the ceiling low, and water dripped steadily from unseen cracks. His own footsteps echoed back at him in uneven rhythms, like someone else was walking just behind. Then the beam of his lantern caught something on the wall. Scratches. Symbols carved into the stone and wooden support beams. Circles, triangles, and jagged lines that made no sense, except that they seemed deliberate. A few feet deeper, bones hung from nails, strung with bits of rotting twine. A goat skull stared down at him, eye sockets stuffed with river reeds. Harlan's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he pressed on. The tunnel curved, and for a heartbeat he swore he heard breathing ahead of him, slow and heavy. He lifted the lantern higher, revealing another burlap mask nailed to the wall, soaked dark with old blood. Then, with no warning, his lantern flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, the tunnel felt alive. Harlan could hear only the drip of water and the faint shuffle of movement just beyond his reach. He stood frozen, revolver in one hand, lantern in the other, as the fog outside seemed safer than the blackness he now faced. For a long, breathless moment, Harlan stood in the dark, frozen in the drainage tunnel, his lantern dead in his hand. The only sounds were the steady drip of water and the distant groan of wind funneling through the marsh above. Then, faintly, another sound crept in. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the stone floor deeper in the tunnel. Harlan fumbled with a match, the small flare of light briefly illuminating the narrow walls scrawled with symbols and the grotesque talismans hanging from the beams. When he relit the lantern, its flicker revealed a bend in the tunnel ahead, where the faint glow of another light pulsed against the stone. He crept forward, careful not to let his boots splash in the shallow water. As he rounded the corner, the scene that met him was a waking nightmare. The butcher was there. He knelt in a circle of severed limbs, carefully arranging them with the slow, deliberate precision of a man at worship. A pair of arms formed a cross. A leg and foot were aligned with the circle's edge, and at the center of it all lay a fresh burlap mask, its stitches glistening with blood. Around the circle, candles sputtered in the damp air, casting jagged shadows across the tunnel walls. Harlan's breath caught. For a heartbeat, he considered raising his revolver, ending the terror right there. But something in the butcher's movements made him hesitate. The killer wasn't startled, wasn't rushing. He moved as though he already knew he was being watched. Then the butcher lifted his head slowly. The hollow eyes of the mask locked onto Harlan, though no words were spoken. The silence was worse than any scream. Suddenly, the butcher snuffed the candles with a sweep of his hand, plunging the tunnel into darkness once more. Harlan spun, firing blindly into the void, as footsteps splashed and echoed, growing fainter until only the drip of water remained. When the sheriff emerged from the tunnel, soaked and shaking, he realized he hadn't stopped a killer that night. He had only witnessed a ritual interrupted. And deep down, he knew the butcher wasn't finished. In the weeks after the tunnel encounter, Willow Creek slipped into a silence that was heavier than fear itself. No new disappearances were reported. No screams pierced the fog. It was as if the butcher had evaporated into the winter air, leaving the town frozen in a limbo of dread. Sheriff Harlan could hardly sleep. Every creak of the old floorboards, every groan of the wind against his shutters made his hand twitch toward the revolver at his bedside. He rode the trails nightly, sometimes circling the abandoned farms for hours, lantern light flickering against the snow. The empty houses stared back at him like hollow skulls, their windows dark and unblinking. The townsfolk mistook the quiet for safety, but Harlan knew better. The butcher wasn't gone. He was waiting. He had seen that look in predators before, the patience of a hunter who knows his prey will panic eventually. Then came the dreams. Harlan began to wake in cold sweats. The image of the ritual circle in the tunnel burned into his mind. He would hear the soft splash of unseen footsteps, the wet drag of limbs across stone. Some nights, he swore he heard a whispering voice calling his name from outside his window, only to find the yard empty and the fog pressed tight against the glass. Winter deepened, and the town withdrew entirely into itself. No one attended church anymore. The trading post sat empty for days at a time. Families that had survived the first wave of terror now refused to speak of the missing, as if pretending they had never existed might protect the living. Then, one evening, Harlan found the trail to the creek untouched by any new snow. Fresh, elongated footprints snaked toward the marsh, barely indenting the frost, as if the man, or whatever he was, floated just above the earth. They led to the edge of the creek and vanished into the fog. The sheriff stood alone in the biting cold, heart pounding in his chest, and realized this was no reprieve at all. It was the pause before the next offering. By the spring of 1872, Willow Creek was no longer just a place. It had become a story whispered in fear. Traders passing through the region carried tales of a town swallowed by fog and haunted by a faceless butcher, spreading its name far beyond the marshlands. Neighbors in nearby settlements spoke of Willow Creek the way others spoke of cursed battlefields or plague towns, a place you left behind in the rear view of your life and never returned to. For the people still trapped there, survival became a quiet ritual of its own. Doors stayed bolted, curtains stayed drawn. Children were shushed before they could even ask questions. The town lived in darkness, both literal and figurative, because anyone who dared to wander outside at night risked vanishing without a trace. In this suffocating isolation, the legend of the butcher began to take shape. Some claimed he was a man driven mad by war, hiding in the marsh since the days of the Union and Confederate skirmishes, feeding his hunger on the living. Others swore he wasn't a man at all, but a spirit of the land, a revenant that rose whenever the valley had gone too long without blood. The empty child-sized coffins, the ritual circles, and the word offering became pieces of a story that seemed almost older than the town itself. Sheriff Harlan didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in the power of fear to rewrite reality. He watched as families abandoned their farms in the dead of night, leaving doors ajar and wagons half-loaded, too afraid to stay long enough to pack. Willow Creek was rotting from the inside out, and the butcher didn't need to lift a finger to finish it. One foggy evening, Harlan rode past the old Murdoch property, now nothing more than a silhouette of ruin against the dim sky. For a moment he swore he saw a figure standing in the upper window, burlap mask faintly visible in the dying light. He dismounted, heart pounding, and approached slowly. But when he stepped inside, the house was empty, silent except for the creak of the wind through broken boards. Outside, the fog closed in again, as if swallowing the memory whole. As winter gave way to the muddy thaw of 1872, Willow Creek's story began to drift into the annals of American whispers. Beyond the valley, townsfolk in other settlements began to speak the butcher's name with the same morbid awe reserved for urban horrors. But what made him different was where he hunted. America had known killers before. In the cities, crowded streets and desperate poverty bred men like H. Holmes, who would, years later, lure victims into the dark heart of Chicago. In the Western Territories, traveling murderers stalked stagecoaches and lonely saloons. But rural serial killers were rare, and that made the Willow Creek Butcher uniquely terrifying. Cities offered anonymity. Willow Creek offered isolation. Out here there were no quick calls for help, no neighbors within shouting distance, no lawmen who could ride in time to intervene. When the fog swallowed a home, it was as if the world ended at the edge of the field. This isolation gave the butcher a hunting ground unlike any other. He didn't need to hide from society. He existed outside of it. The emptiness of the valley, the twisting creek trails, the decaying drainage tunnels, all of it formed a perfect stage for his rituals. In towns and cities, killers could be caught by chance encounters or curious witnesses. In Willow Creek, there were no witnesses. Newspapers in the nearest county seat began to pick up the story, though they treated it as half folklore, half fact. One article called the butcher a phantom of the marsh, feeding the land what it demands. Another described the town as lost to the mist and its demons. But while the outside world speculated, the horror inside Willow Creek was all too real. Sheriff Harlan, exhausted and hollow-eyed, began to feel like a man living in a story no one would ever fully believe. And still, he rode the trails alone at night, lantern swaying, knowing the fog was his only company, and perhaps his only witness. Then, in early spring, someone claimed to see the butcher again. More than a decade had passed since the last confirmed disappearance in Willow Creek. By 1883, the town was little more than a memory, its houses sagging into the soil, barns collapsed under their own neglect. Most families had fled long ago, and the valley existed only in the fearful stories told in neighboring settlements. But on a cold March morning, a lone hunter named Samuel Dyer stumbled into a nearby township, white-faced and trembling. He swore he had seen the butcher. Dyer had been following deer tracks along the northern ridge of the old creek trail, where the fog rolled thickest, when he noticed movement in the tree line. At first, he thought it was another hunter. But then, through the mist, he caught a glimpse that turned his blood to ice. A tall figure in a rotting coat, wearing a burlap mask darkened with age and stains. The figure did not move like a man. Dyer claimed it stood perfectly still for several minutes, watching him, before turning its head with a slow, unnatural motion, as if testing the air. Then, without a sound, it stepped back into the fog and vanished. Terrified, Dyer retraced his steps toward the ridge, but curiosity drove him to investigate the spot where the figure had stood. There, carved into the trunk of a half-dead oak, were two words, "Offering returns." Beneath the carving, the mud was disturbed, as though someone had knelt there recently. Dyer swore he saw the faint impression of fingers pressed into the earth, but no clear footprints led away. It was as if the fog itself had swallowed the figure whole. When word of the sighting spread, old fears came roaring back. Farmers in neighboring towns began avoiding the valley altogether, and some insisted the land was cursed. A few adventurous souls tried to investigate the abandoned farms, but most returned after a single night, claiming the fog whispered to them when the wind died down. Sheriff Harlan, now an old man living far from the marsh, received word of Dyer's sighting. For the first time in years, he opened his old ledger, running a finger over the sketches of masks, circles, and symbols. He said nothing to anyone, but his nightmares returned that night. By the end of the 1880s, Willow Creek had become more myth than memory. Few dared to travel through the abandoned valley, and those who did returned with stories that sounded like campfire tales, fog that whispered their names, shadows that followed just out of sight, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched from the tree line. Children in neighboring towns whispered dares to each other: "Walk the creek trail at night, and the butcher will take you." Adults who had once dismissed the stories now treated the valley like cursed ground. Hunters gave it a wide berth, and the old creek bridge began to rot away, nature reclaiming the last human path into the marsh. By 1890, the legend had evolved. The butcher was no longer just a man who killed. He was a force, a spirit of the land in the minds of the superstitious. Locals said he rose with the fog, claimed his offerings, and vanished when the valley was fed. And like all legends, it grew teeth again when blood was rumored to return. That summer, a traveling salesman named Horace Bell set out to cut through the abandoned valley, hoping to save a day's ride between towns. He was last seen crossing the outskirts at dusk. His horse returned to the neighboring town 3 days later, saddle still on, eyes wild and rolling. Bell himself was never seen again. Search parties braved the fog for 2 days, but no trace of him was found. The only discovery was unsettling enough to end the search. A single glove, nailed to the doorframe of the old Murdoch house, fingers pointing upward. Beneath it, faintly scratched into the wood, was that single word again: offering. The incident cemented the butcher's place in local law. Parents no longer had to invent bedtime warnings. The valley itself became a story to terrify children into obedience. And for those who believed the butcher was a man, not a myth, the missing salesman was proof enough. He was still out there, patient as the fog itself. By the turn of the century, Willow Creek was no longer a town. It was a skeleton picked clean by time. Roofs collapsed under the weight of endless winters, barns leaned and split like broken teeth, and the dirt roads that once carried wagons vanished beneath weeds and creeping moss. Nature moved in where people had fled. Vines choked fence posts and slithered through cracked windows. Trees grew through the floors of kitchens where families had once shared bread and prayer. In the marshes, cattails swayed where children once played, their brown heads nodding in the fog like mourners. It was as if the land itself had swallowed Willow Creek whole, digesting the last evidence of human life. Travelers who passed through on rare occasions described a profound silence. Even birds seemed to avoid the valley, leaving only the creak of old wood and the distant lap of water against the creek banks. On certain mornings, fog would roll in thick and low, and the outlines of abandoned homes would appear and vanish like phantoms. Locals in nearby towns began calling it the Ghost Valley, and yet signs of the butcher remained. Those brave enough or foolish enough to step into the ruins sometimes reported finding doors nailed shut from the outside, as though Omiwan had been sealing something in. On one rotting porch, a visitor claimed to find a child's rocking horse swaying back and forth, though there was no wind. The most chilling discovery came in the spring of 1900, when 2 hunters followed a deer into the old Whitaker property. In the mud near the barn they found a single fresh footprint, long, narrow, and deep at the toes, as if the heel had barely touched the earth. When they fled and reported it in town, an old man who had lived through the original horrors only muttered one thing: "The fog doesn't hide him. The fog is his." In that moment, the butcher's legacy was complete. The land, the silence, and the ruins of Willow Creek no longer felt abandoned. They felt owned. In the spring of 1901, Willow Creek briefly stirred with life again, though not the kind the valley wanted. A land survey team had been sent to assess the abandoned farms for possible reclamation, part of a state effort to turn forsaken settlements into farmland once more. The crew arrived with wagons, shovels, and a casual confidence. Most had dismissed the butcher as nothing more than a local ghost story. Their confidence didn't last. On the second day, as workers cleared the overgrown fields behind the old Murdoch property, one man's shovel struck something hollow beneath the wet soil. Thinking it might be a buried trunk or barrel, they began to dig, and unearthed a coffin no longer than 4 feet. Its wood was blackened with rot, its nails rusted to a deep red. Excitement turned to dread when they pried it open. Inside, there was no body, only a lining of straw and deep gouge marks, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Shaken but determined, the surveyors kept digging. By sundown, they had uncovered 5 more coffins, each identical in size and decay. 4 were empty like the first, but the last one held something far worse than a body. Inside lay a burlap mask, its fabric stiff with old blood and caked mud, still wet from the earth as though it had been buried only days ago. The mask's hollow eyes seemed to stare up at them, and a rank odour of rot and stagnant water poured from the coffin. That night, the crew abandoned camp and fled the valley. When the state office received their report, it quietly shelved the reclamation project. Officially, the site was marked as unsuitable for development. Locals in neighbouring towns said it more plainly. The land won't let go of him. In the weeks after the excavation, hunters claimed to see fresh scratches on the old Murdoch barn, as if someone, or something, was marking its territory again. The butcher, it seemed, did not sleep for long. By 1902, Sheriff James Harlan was an old man, his hair white, his back bent, but his mind still chained to Willow Creek. He had left the valley years earlier, yet the butcher had followed him, not in body, but in memory. He kept a small journal on his bedside table, its leather cracked and weathered, filled with sketches and notes that no one else in his family dared to read. The entries began like official report. T.S., recounting the Murdochs, the Whitakers, the rituals in the tunnels. But as the years passed, the writing shifted, turning into the words of a man haunted. The lines blurred between fact and fear. The fog speaks. It says he waits. I see the circle every time I close my eyes. The masks are not faces. They are doors. In the margins, he sketched the coffins they'd found by the creek, the jagged symbols on the tunnel walls, and the spiral of limbs he had witnessed in the darkness. Some pages were smeared with what looked like dried mud, or dried blood. The final entries were shorter, more frantic. I hear the steps again outside my window. He does not hunt the land anymore. He hunts me. The offering is never over. Then one last line, barely legible, scrawled with a shaking hand. I am not alone tonight. Harlan's family found the journal on the morning of his death. He had passed quietly in his sleep. No sign of struggle, yet his window was wide open. Outside, the ground beneath the sill was wet, though no rain had fallen the night before. The journal was never given to authorities. Locals said the family burned it, fearing that keeping the words would invite the fog into their own home. But copies of his early entries survived, whispered among neighbouring towns, feeding the legend of the butcher like kindling on an old fire. Even in death, Harlan could not escape the feeling that the butcher had never been a man to capture, but a shadow to outlast him. And in the valley he had once sworn to protect, the fog continued to rise. After Sheriff Harlan's death, the last official thread connecting Willow Creek to the outside world snapped. There would be no further investigations, no new arrests, and no justice for the missing families. The case was closed, not by evidence, but by exhaustion. Newspapers of the time treated the story like a fading ghost tale. A few published brief articles about the vanishing valley, while others suggested that the butcher had been nothing more than a vagrant or a war deserter who eventually died in the marsh. But locals knew better. They had seen the coffins, the masks, the ritual circles carved into wood and dirt. Those weren't the work of a drifter. In the years that followed, strange patterns continued to emerge. Travelers passing through neighboring towns sometimes failed to reach their destinations. Hunters reported hearing soft splashes in the creek, followed by the faint impression of footsteps behind them that never left tracks. By 1910, the missing were few and scattered, but whispers began to connect the dots. Disappearances along the same creek trail, always when the fog was thickest. Authorities in nearby counties refused to acknowledge a connection, insisting that the Willow Creek Butcher was a relic of folklore. But evidence still seeped through the cracks. One farmer's boy claimed he wandered too close to the valley and found a single wooden coffin half buried in the mud, lid cracked open and straw spilling into the water. Another hunter swore he saw a flicker of lantern light moving slowly along the creek at night, though the town had been abandoned for years. To those who believed, these moments were proof that the legend was not finished. To skeptics, they were echoes of fear passed from one generation to the next. Either way, Willow Creek remained untouched. No one rebuilt the farms. No one cleared the trails. The land seemed to reject the living, keeping its secrets and its shadows to itself. And deep in the valley, where fog hugged the marsh and the water ran black, the silence was never truly empty. By the mid-20th century, Willow Creek had fully transformed from tragedy to legend. Its story appeared in regional ghost books, whispered in diners and bars, and passed like contraband between schoolchildren who dared each other to walk the abandoned trail. The name Willow Creek Butcher had become synonymous with rural horror, a tale of fog, masks, and offerings that refused to fade. Then came the thrill-seekers. By the 1950s, urban explorers, amateur historians, and self-proclaimed ghost hunters began venturing into the valley. They carried flashlights and cameras, walking the collapsed bridges and skeletal barns in hopes of catching a glimpse of the butcher or something he had left behind. Some of them returned with stories that echoed the past. One group swore they heard a child laughing softly in the fog, though no footprints appeared in the wet earth. Another described lantern light moving along the creek, swaying gently before vanishing without sound. The most compelling accounts came from recorded equipment. In 1957, a team left an audio recorder overnight in the ruins of the Whitaker barn. When they retrieved it, the tape captured a faint scraping sound that repeated every few seconds, followed by a soft, wet breathing, like someone standing just behind the microphone. Near the end of the tape, a single word was whispered: offering. Skeptics dismissed these reports as hoaxes or hysteria, but the evidence piled up in ways that were hard to ignore. Even the local sheriff's office, which had long refused to speak of the butcher, quietly issued warnings to hunters and campers about entering the valley at night. Then, in 1962, a pair of hikers reported finding a fresh burlap mask nailed to the trunk of a tree, its stitches crude and still damp with creek water. Beneath it, the soil had been disturbed in a perfect circle. The story that had once been folklore now had modern witnesses, and the legend of the Willow Creek Butcher had stepped quietly into a new century, as patient and deliberate as the fog itself. By the late 20th century, curiosity about Willow Creek evolved into investigation. Crime historians, anthropologists, and amateur sleuths began to revisit the butcher's story with modern tools, hoping to separate folklore from fact. Sheriff Harlan's old ledger surfaced briefly in the hands of a private collector, revealing sketches of the ritual circles, the empty coffins, and the crude masks. Forensic experts analyzed the materials he'd described. The teeth marks on the coffin wood were not those of animals. They appeared human, but filed to sharp points, as though the biter had intentionally transformed their own mouth into a weapon. Even more disturbing were the patterns in the rituals, Researchers cross-referenced Harlan's notes with the sites of known disappearances and unearthed artifacts from the valley. Evite. Airy's circle of limbs followed a precise alignment, matching the compass directions and the flow of the creek's current. This wasn't random carnage. It was premeditated ceremony. Modern analysis also confirmed that the burlap masks were soaked in a combination of blood and marsh water, the fibers hardened with age. Trace elements suggested animal remains had been used in the stitching, giving the masks a ritualistic, totem-like purpose. To the experts, this indicated that the butcher's acts were less about impulse and more about devotion. To what, they could not determine. The investigations deepened the horror because every answer raised new questions. If the butcher was a man, how had he evaded capture for decades? How had he disappeared and reappeared without leaving a single confirmed body for the authorities? And if he wasn't entirely human, as some began to whisper, what did the ritual sustain? A chilling report came from one forensic team that camped overnight near the old Whitaker farm in the 1980s. They claimed to hear light splashes in the creek, followed by the distant sound of wood being dragged across the ground. When they examined the area at dawn, a crude circle of twigs and bones had been arranged less than 30 feet from their tent, while their motion sensors never triggered once. Willow Creek, it seemed, still obeyed its oldest master. The last widely accepted sighting of the Willow Creek Butcher came in the autumn of 1952, though its details would haunt the region for decades. A traveling photographer named Leonard Briggs had taken to exploring abandoned settlements, seeking eerie landscapes for a personal project. When he heard the whispers about Willow Creek, he saw opportunity instead of warning. Briggs entered the valley on a fog-heavy evening, carrying an old camera and a single lantern. He set up near the collapsed frame of the Whitaker barn, where the fog pooled like smoke in a hollowed lung. He later told investigators that the silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. As he waited for the last of the light to fade, he felt it first. The sensation of being watched. The hair on his arms rose. Slowly through the mist, a figure emerged near the tree line. Briggs described him in chilling detail. A tall, gaunt silhouette wrapped in a rotting coat, and on his head, a burlap mask stitched crudely into a permanent grimace. The figure didn't walk toward him. Instead, it stood perfectly still, head slightly cocked, as if considering him. Terrified but entranced, Briggs raised his camera and snapped a photograph. The flash pierced the fog for only a heartbeat, and when his vision cleared, the figure was gone. Investigators found Briggs's camera and developed the film. Most of the shots were of the valley, pale and blurred by mist. But in one photograph, a dark, elongated shape lingered at the very edge of the frame, almost lost in the fog. While skeptics dismissed it as a trick of light, locals knew the silhouette immediately. The story grew darker when Briggs recounted the final moments of that night. After the flash, he heard 3 slow knocks on the trunk of a nearby tree, followed by a whisper carried on the fog. A single word. Offering. Shaken, Briggs fled the valley and never returned. He died in 1974, still insisting that the butcher had posed for him that night and let him live as part of the legend. By the late 20th century, Willow Creek had become a place defined not by the living, but by its fog. It rolled in without warning, swallowing the marshes, the abandoned farms, and the skeletal barns, until the entire valley seemed to vanish from the world. Those who had ventured close swore that the fog carried weight, a chill that crept under the skin, and a sound, a low hum or whispering that was hard to place. Locals began to call it the butcher's breath. Every few years, thrill-seekers and historians returned, drawn by the legend. They walked the rotting bridge, now half submerged in the creek, and wandered the trails that had once carried farmers to market. Many reported that time felt different inside the fog, as if hours passed in minutes, or minutes stretched into something unending. One hiker, interviewed in 1988, recalled seeing movement in the mist just ahead of him. "It was like a shadow walking," he said, "but when I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it followed. He left the valley without looking back, convinced he had been escorted out by something that wanted him gone. Even more disturbing were the unexplained sounds. Some heard the soft splash of water, though they were nowhere near the creek. Others claimed to hear faint footsteps just behind them, always pausing when they turned around. A few even spoke of whispers, short, sharp words that were impossible to understand, except for one that seemed to repeat itself through the decades. Offering. By now, the butcher had transcended being a man, a killer, or even a local legend. He had become part of the valley itself. The fog was his cloak, the marsh his altar, and the ruins of Willow Creek his eternal hunting ground. Those who dared to enter swore that the silence was never truly silent, that the land listened, and that leaving the valley didn't mean escaping it, because the butcher only needed to be seen once to follow you home in your dreams. Today, the Willow Creek Butcher is remembered as more than a local terror. He is etched into the darker pages of American history as the nation's first rural serial killer. While city-bound monsters like H.H. Holmes would later claim headlines, the butcher haunted a place where newspapers could barely reach, allowing his legend to fester in isolation until it became something larger than life. Historians now view Willow Creek as a study in perfect conditions for horror. Its remoteness, its perpetual fog, and its deeply superstitious population created a hunting ground where fear itself became the butcher's ally. He did not need to strike often. He let the isolation do his work, letting the town collapse under the weight of its own dread. The physical evidence, the empty child-sized coffins, the ritual circles, the burlap masks, has only deepened the mystery. No clear motive has ever been established. No living witness ever saw him unmasked, and the absence of bodies ensured that in the official record, he existed as a rumor that refused to die. Psychologists have called him a pioneer of fear as a weapon, a killer who understood that dominating the imagination of a community was more powerful than any blade. Folklorists have noted that the story has all the hallmarks of a cautionary tale. Wander too far, disrespect the land, ignore the old whispers, and the fog will take you. But for the people of Willow Creek, it was never a story. It was life and death. Families abandoned their homes, children vanished without graves, and an entire town was swallowed whole, leaving nothing but rotting wood and the endless rolling mist. Even now, the legend feeds on itself. Paranormal enthusiasts call the valley America's rural heart of darkness. Online forums trade alleged photographs, distorted audio of whispered words, and maps marking where the butcher is most often seen. Skeptics roll their eyes, but they don't step into the fog to prove the legend false. And as long as the wind still carries the marsh's cold breath, as long as the mist still curls around the old fence posts, the story of the Willow Creek Butcher will remain a living part of American macabre history, a shadow that waits for anyone willing to walk his trail. The fog still waits over Willow Creek. Step onto the old trail today, and you will hear what generations before you heard, the wind pushing through broken barns, the creek lapping at its muddy banks, and that strange hollow quiet that makes your skin crawl. Look closely, and you'll see the land's memory etched into every shadow. The leaning fence posts, the rotted doors nailed shut, the half-sunken foundations of homes that belonged to families who never returned. If you linger long enough, your own breath will join the fog, and you may feel the weight of unseen eyes from the tree line. Hunters, hikers, thrill-seekers, many have walked in, and most leave as quickly as they came, chilled by a sense that the land itself knows they are trespassers. Because the Willow Creek Butcher is more than a man or a myth. He is a pattern, a shadow on the edge of America's rural history, a story that survives because fear itself keeps it alive. Every whisper of offering, every abandoned farm, every uneasy glance into the mist is a thread in the tapestry he left behind. And maybe he never left at all. Some believe he is still out there, standing perfectly still in the fog, patient as ever, waiting for someone foolish enough to step off the trail and into his hunting ground. Others say it doesn't matter if he's a man, a ghost, or a memory, because once you know his story, you carry him with you. So the next time you drive a lonely country road and the mist curls low across the fields, ask yourself one question. Is that just the wind? Or is someone waiting in the fog? If you've walked this far with me through the darkness, then you are exactly the kind of soul the Macabre record is meant for. Subscribe and follow us deeper into the forgotten corners of history, where shadows linger and the next story is already waiting in the dark.